This episode is made possible by Audible. Follow the link below and get your first month absolutely free. In 2016, McDonald's wrote an IOU on a piece of paper and sent it from London to Singapore, then from Singapore to Delaware, and then from Delaware back to London. Now, they won't have to pay $400 million in taxes. What? This is the story of how McDonald's used an intangible asset, multiple tax havens, and broke a whole bunch of laws to get out of paying taxes for the next 10 years.
None of us wants to pay them, but what's even worse is when you think you're paying yours and the other guy isn't.
So while McDonald's workers struggle to live on poverty wages, McDonald's tax bill stays low. Moving paper around the world shouldn't reduce your tax bill by millions.
This is a McDonald's. Sorry, that might be hard to recognize out of its usual context. This is a McDonald's. At least that's what you and I think of when we think of McDonald's. A place, a restaurant, the food we eat after a night out and pretend never happened the next day. McDonald's, the company, disagrees. For the company, McDonald's is an idea. Kind of like how Coca-Cola is friendship in a bottle. Or the new Chevy Bronco is masculinity in a car. Or the Scrub Daddy is patriarchal BDSM roleplay in a sponge. Kinky. For McDonald's, the company, McDonald's isn't the burgers themselves. It's the idea behind the burgers. What makes McDonald's valuable isn't selling food, or toys, or employing millions of people at poverty wages and working them for 9 hours a day, 5 days a week, while they push billions of dollars of inventory out of the kitchen. No, according to the executives that run the company, what makes McDonald's valuable is the brand. The symbols that get your rum-soaked brain to end the night spending money on salt and red cardboard. For you and me, that distinction isn't all that important. We don't care if McDonald's is more brand than food. Leave it to the philosophy majors to debate over the dialectical ontology of McDonald's as brand and being, with marketing majors who think brands sure are good. But from a legal perspective, the distinction between McDonald's the idea and McDonald's the thing we eat actually matters. That's because of something called an intangible asset. Intangible assets are things that exist and have value, but don't have a physical substance. It's things like brand recognition, intellectual property, or your mother's love. Valuable stuff. The great thing is that intangible assets, in a few key places around the world, aren't taxed in quite the same way as hold-em-in-your-hand tangible assets, allowing for some pretty lucrative tax havens. Let's take Delaware, for example. In an idea I'm straight up ripping from my good friends at the Half as Interesting channel, let's imagine I started a company here in Texas. Let's call it Second Brought. Our slogan is, "What's the point of a single sausage?" And our logo looks like this. Let's imagine I make a killing selling sausages in Texas, but I don't really want to pay taxes. Here's what I could do. I could create a subsidiary company in Delaware. That company is going to be the one that has the rights to Second Brought's intangible assets, the company name, the logo, and the slogan. Delaware Second Brought owns it. They, being me, are very kind to let me use the brand identity, but they don't let me use it for free. They, still me but just in Delaware, charge me $1 million in licensing fees for the name, logo, and slogan of Second Brought. Lucky for me, I made $1,000,050 selling sausages in Texas, so I'm fine. Once I've paid the Delaware subsidiary, I still have 50 cents in net income in the state of Texas, and that's the amount the state of Texas will be able to tax me on. The state of Delaware isn't taxing me on the remaining $999,999.50 because they don't tax intangible assets. How convenient. This is a simplified version of what McDonald's did. After getting their McFingers McSlapped by the EU, McDonald's set up a subsidiary in the City of London, the UK's version of Delaware, equally well known for being boring and having like nothing going on. From the City of London offices of McD Global Franchising Limited, an intangible asset of McDonald's, quote, franchise rights was purchased from another subsidiary, this one in Singapore, for £2.6 billion, or $3.4 billion. McDonald's London offices didn't actually pay for that asset, mind you, but rather simply promised to pay at a later date with a loan note, or in real people words, an IOU. That IOU was then transferred to another subsidiary in Singapore, and then another subsidiary in Delaware, before finally making its way back to London. Once it got to London, the loan was cancelled, because you can't owe money to yourself. And McDonald's could claim that the value of the intangible asset was depreciating over time, that the ideas are getting old and therefore losing value. These two things combined, moving the piece of paper around and claiming it's losing value in the process, meant that the UK subsidiary had a tax bill of £0 in 2018 and would save around $400 million in taxes over the next decade. This kind of process, sometimes called layering, has a very specific purpose. Having this incredibly complex structure makes it really hard to prosecute, not only in terms of which country should do it, but it's also really hard to get your head around what is even going on. War on Want, the charity that uncovered this story, alleges that the McDonald's Corporation has broken several laws throughout this process, and urges the UK tax authority, the HMRC, to investigate and determine whether this is the case. What happens now is anyone's guess. In any case, McDonald's behavior is nothing new. Companies have always moved money around to evade tax laws. Large tech companies like Google and Apple have operated in low-tax countries like Ireland for a long time. The Panama and subsequent Pandora Papers showed how trillions of dollars get stashed away in offshore tax havens for years by the world's wealthiest politicians, celebrities, and billionaires. What McDonald's did, as absurd and awful as it is not surprising in the least. The problems with this kind of behavior by corporations and the ultra-wealthy are obvious to most of us. Tax evasion and avoidance are a clear example of wealth and corporate power allowing some people to skirt the law, while most others have no choice but to follow it, always with pretty harmful consequences. Offshoring money, hoarding wealth, evading and avoiding taxes all create a lot of social wrongs, inequality being the big one. We're living in a new Gilded Age, at least in part thanks to these massive efforts to avoid redistributive politics. The scale of the wealth hoarded by a few people compared to the rest of the world is difficult to even fully grasp, and by keeping it locked away somewhere for themselves, they are getting in the way of a more equal society. From inequality, which is already bad on its own, particularly at the scale that exists today, we get a ton of other problems. For starters, and according to the IMF, not a very lefty organization by any means, inequality actually stifles economic growth. They even admit in one of their studies that when the rich get richer, benefits do not trickle down. The IMF said that. The IMF. You know, they're the ones who... But that's not all. Affluence begets influence. And the wealthier the elite are, the more sway they have in nominally democratic societies. When a small minority of tax dodgers get to keep a massive amount of wealth above the rest, it can easily use it to make sure its members can get even more wealth and whatever other government policies they want. Our economy already favors this kind of hoarding and this kind of political decision-making. But tax evasion gives another lever of power to an already powerful group of billionaires who make their money off the exploitation of others. Lobbying, funding, and more generally influencing are much easier to do when you have all that money. And there's also the inflation question. When governments spend, they must always do so with inflation in mind. While inflation isn't directly related to spending, more money in the economy does not always equal inflation, as quote, common sense economists might tell you. It does play a role. So when governments with currency sovereignty like the US are looking to control the money supply in part to avoid inflation, not being able to touch some money because it's hidden away somewhere makes that job more difficult. That means that the money that's easier to touch, the money in your pocket, is probably where those lost taxes get offset. Either that, or governments interested in austerity politics, making everyday people's lives more difficult without touching the great fortunes of the wealthy, will use the rhetoric of not enough money in the bank to cut public services. Even if they have the capacity to fund public services, both by being sovereign currency issuers and having the material resources to carry out public works, tax havens allow governments to pretend like the money just isn't there for public works, schools, hospitals, welfare, food stamps, and other public services. In other words, tax havens give rhetorical power to governments taxing you, not taxing the wealthy, and under-delivering on public services. So to recap, tax havens and other general tax evasion schemes create massive inequality. They stifle economic growth. They obstruct democracy. And they're used to justify austerity politics. As far as a rap sheet goes, very few crimes are quite as damaging to society. So what can we do? In the short term, we have a couple options at our disposal. McDonald's is the world's second largest private employer. Over 2 million people work at McDonald's. If that's you, and statistically this video is going to reach a couple of you, join the efforts to unionize. In 2017, McDonald's workers in the UK joined another union, the Bakers, Food and Allied Workers Union, and by striking, won McDonald's workers across the UK the biggest pay raise in over 10 years. If your McDonald's franchise isn't at that stage yet, the IWW, International Workers of the World, has resources to create a militant labor union in your workplace. They've got a form on their website where you can provide a little info and get in touch with expert organizers who can help you unionize your workplace. If you're not employed, or if your job is already unionized, you can still help this process by handing out pamphlets or other information in the stores you visit. Just be subtle about it. You don't want to get the employees in trouble. The IWW has a variety of documents you can print out and distribute to those who would like to learn more about what it means to be part of a union. I've linked these in the description. Taking money out of McDonald's hands and putting it directly into the hands of the workers can only be a good thing, and would reduce the company's ability to dodge taxes in the first place. Money is easy to move around. Restaurants and workers, not so much. Twist their arm a little. If you don't work at McDonald's, or you're uncomfortable handing out literature, War on Want, the charity that uncovered McDonald's £2.6 billion IOU to itself, has a petition on their website for you to sign, demanding that the UK tax authorities investigate the issue and recover the missing taxes. Just bear in mind, a petition has no official power. Doing actual organizing is always more effective. Anyway, that's for the short term. For the long term, several options are available as well. For starters, countries could shut down their tax havens. While we tend to imagine offshore tax paradises as sunny islands with beautiful white sand beaches and ugly white tourists, far away and beyond our reach, the leading tax havens are right here in the imperial core. The US and the UK are tax havens, as are smaller locations within them like Delaware and the City of London. Bermuda, the Cayman Islands, Guernsey, Jersey, and the Isle of Man aren't just tax havens, they're British dependencies and overseas territories. In continental Europe, Switzerland, Luxembourg, Germany, Belgium, and Cyprus are all in some way or another tax havens, and with the exception of Switzerland, are all part of the EU. The political jurisdiction over many of the world's tax havens are in the countries that I know a majority of you are watching from. But these countries will often argue that they're forced into this competition over tax rates. They'll say that racing to the bottom is the only way to attract direct investment. Unfortunately for them, a couple of studies have shown that that ultimately plays a much smaller role than these countries pretend it does. Corporate tax rates aren't as big a deal as things like labor costs, skill levels, infrastructure quality, and political stability when it comes to attracting international investment, meaning that the countries where tax havens are primarily located actually have a lot of agency when it comes to shutting them down. What they're missing is a little bit of political will, but most crucially political power in the face of international capital, which, as we know, can foil political programs in the general public's interest. And here we might find some of the bigger limitations to all these, quote, solutions. We can try to close tax havens down, we can unionize, and we can sign petitions, but until the power is truly in the public's hands, this process will be incredibly difficult. It will have very little guarantee of success, very little guarantee of stability, and it might mean making neoliberal reforms that ultimately hurt the very people we're trying to save. So long as wealth is in so few hands to start with, political mobilization from the public is incredibly difficult to translate into political action. Programs that help average people are hard to fight for against the interests of a few companies. Wealth can just skip over democracy and make governments accountable only to the wealthy and their inhuman greed. We can, and absolutely should, move towards eliminating tax havens. We need to try to close the loopholes that made the McDonald's IOU possible. But we can also recognize that the only reason it happened this way is because a couple years before, the EU had closed some other loophole the company was taking advantage of. Closing loopholes is great, but not only does it create new loopholes to exploit, it doesn't really address the core reasons these companies are able to avoid taxes in the first place. They have a ton of money, and they aren't subject to democratic control. Regulations and taxation are an attempt at controlling these companies. But by only doing so after all the money has been made, and in such indirect terms, gives a free pass for these companies to spend incredible amounts of their gains hiring people to waste their lives scouring legal documents and sending digital contracts from one country to the next in whatever daisy chain means keeping money out of the public's hands. So long as private corporations have this kind of money to play around with, truly stringent regulations will never come to pass, and what little legislation we do get will always leave room for the well-off to continue exploiting the system and the people they hire. I won't lie to you, it's kind of difficult to imagine what nationalizing a company like McDonald's might look like, or even turning it into a co-op, or what it would mean to rein in international markets. But it will be necessary. Otherwise, tax havens will continue to proliferate, and the inequality that is ravaging our society will only grow. So long as world governments are entirely beholden to capital, we will never have actual democracy. The secret world of tax havens and loopholes is difficult to fully comprehend, but it also represents one of the single most destructive forces to global democracy we've ever faced. I try my best to learn and understand as much as I can so I can share it with others, and one way I like to do that is by listening to audiobooks. I travel a lot for work, so I have plenty of time to sit on planes and listen to fascinating audiobooks on Audible. One great one that I recently listened to is Treasure Islands by Nicholas Shaxson. This work is perhaps the single most enlightening explainer of tax havens and their consequences I've ever found. If you're like me and the nuts and bolts of tax code and logistics are confusing to you, this audiobook is your one-stop shop to fix that, and have a good time doing it. It's one thing to write a rigorously sourced and factually correct investigation, but it's entirely something else to do that and make it entertaining. If you like to learn as much as I do, getting to pick a free audiobook every month is pretty nice. I don't think I can accurately convey how much I love Audible. I struggle to sit down and read a book, but with Audible, I can get through all the titles I've wanted to, all while running errands, or commuting, or traveling for work. It's completely changed how I learn. If you enjoyed this week's video, I highly recommend you check out Treasure Islands on Audible. It's a fantastic listen. So, if you'd like to help support my channel so I can produce more content like this, visit audible.com/secondthought, or text second thought, one word, to 500-500. Sign up today and get your first month absolutely free. It really does help support me and my channel. Get started by following the link below, or by texting second thought to 500-500. If you enjoyed this video, consider dropping a like. If you hated it, a thumbs down. You can check out my previous episodes by clicking the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.